Good morning, everyone. I am Aaron Blumberg, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, MARC Basics, and I'd also like to welcome today's presenter, Maureen McCrory. Maureen McCrory, MLIS and PhD, was a catalog librarian and reference librarian at Oberlin College from 1995 to 2000, and has been a technical services librarian at Hillsdale College for the past 17 years. Her responsibilities at Hillsdale for all of those years have included the supervision of acquisitions, collection development, and cataloging of all monographic and AV material, as well as the management of the library's innovative ILS. On her time off from Hillsdale, Maureen teaches a course in knowledge organization online from Dominican University. Please welcome Maureen and enjoy her webinar this morning. Maureen? Um, is the sound all right for everyone else? I apologize, it might be my fault. Okay. And Maureen, I'm not sure if you can hear me. Your microphone is not on.
How's
There
that?
we go.
Can you? Okay. Yep, that was my fault. Sorry about that. All right, let's try again. Um, I'm going to start talking. I hope people will let me know if there are problems. I will try to monitor the chat. I'll try to watch. Feel free to ask questions or tell me you can't hear me in the chat. During the presentation, I'll try to keep an eye on it, and I know Erin will tell me if things are going wrong. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad really happy to be back with the Florida people doing this presentation. I've done a few of them over the past year or so and really enjoyed it. Uh, this is kind of an introduction to MARC, to the MARC format, and then I understand that on Friday, Dr. Karen Snow, who also teaches where I do at Dominican, is going to do an in-person kind of intensive workshop on using MARC according to RDA standards. So I hope you can all do both of those things. Karen and I have worked a little bit together, so this is kind of an introduction to what she'll be going into more depth in on Friday. But this can stand alone too if you just want to get a little information about MARC. I wanted to get a sense, and I didn't set up a poll today, but I wanted to get a sense of how people feel about MARC, whether or not they use MARC. Maybe you could just do a chat response. Do you use MARC on a daily basis? Have you seen MARC records, or is it completely foreign to you? Just get a sense of things as people type in answers. Um, okay, yep. So a lot of this will be stuff you already know, but I hope that we can touch on a few things that might be new to you. And I'd love to hear if you have comments on what I'm presenting. I'd love to hear what you have to say about some of the things we're going to talk about today. So I'll try to leave plenty of room for discussion and questions as well. Okay, so let's get started. And I think I do drive the slides, don't I? Yeah. Okay. What is MARC? MARC is an acronym for Machine Readable Cataloging. Machine readable meaning that it can be used by computers. It seems kind of obvious now that if we're doing cataloging, we're doing it so that machines or computers can understand it. But when MARC was created, this was a pretty revolutionary idea. Computers were just being started to be used. Libraries were just starting to explore how they might use them, and the Library of Congress was part of that group saying, well, how can we improve our processes? How can we share our cataloging data more efficiently? The Library of Congress had been selling cards for decades by the 1960s, but they figured there must be a more efficient way to get the data they were creating out to libraries throughout the country. And so they started exploring the possibility of using computers to do this. pretty uncharted territory at that time. They started this project in 1965, which actually was the year I was born. I'm the same age as Mark, I guess. Um, they started this project to explore the idea, and they had some partner libraries, some big universities like Stanford and Rice, some other participating libraries that were also interested in exploring the possibilities of using computers to share um, library data, bibliographic data, catalog data. Um, and so they started a pilot project in 1966 with the goal of giving LC's bibliographic data created according to their standards to these participating libraries in a machine-readable form. They wanted to basically make this card data, the data they had been sharing on cards for all these decades, available in electronic form. They at that time using tapes, reel-to-reel tapes, was how the data was recorded and sent through the mail to other libraries. So this was pre-internet even. So who did the actual creation of this MARC format? Library of Congress hired someone to do it, someone who was not a librarian, who didn't have a background in library and information science. Of course, information science didn't really exist at the time. There was library science. Information science kind of developed as a result of this programmer's work. Henriette D. Avram, and it was actually unusual for a woman to be doing programming at the time, but Ms. Avram was hired as the programmer to create this format for sharing this bibliographic data electronically. She started out, she was born in 1919, she started out as pre-med at Hunter College, ended up not finishing her college degree, got married instead, had kids, raised her kids as women typically did in the 60s. Once her kids were grown, she went back to school, apparently at her husband's urging, to study mathematics at George Washington University. Um, her husband was working for the NSA, for the National Security Administration at the time, and I think part of her ideal was that she could work there too. She just needed a little bit more education. So after she had studied mathematics, I don't think she even received a degree in that, but she ended up with a job at the NSA in 1952, worked there for several years, ended up learning programming while she was at the NSA, and then being hired by a company called Datatrol, a programming company, a very early software company, um, and continued her programming work there. And at that point, saw the position at the Library of Congress. They might have even sought her out. I wasn't clear on that history exactly. But in the end, LC ended up hiring her specifically to guide this project, which eventually became known as the MARC project. There are a couple of references there. Interesting, these were obituaries from when she died in 2006 in the Washington Post and the New York Times. I would read those with a grain of salt. They're very interesting articles, but they get some of the details wrong. It's clear that these were not librarians who wrote the articles, but they're interesting and colorful. MARC now is managed by the Library of Congress still. It's still a Library of Congress standard, and so it's managed by the Library of Congress's Network Development and MARC Standards Office. This office manages all of the standards that LC develops and uses, and it's a long list of things that they're responsible for. But the list includes MARC 21, which is the current version of the MARC standard, MARC XML, which is also in extensive use in libraries now. It's an XML version of the MARC format. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute about what XML is and why it's important. And they are also managing the Bibliographic Format Initiative, also known as BibFrame. BibFrame is slated to become the replacement for MARC, and we're going to talk about that a little bit too, why we need a replacement for MARC and how BibFrame is going to fulfill that need. MARC 21, the current standard, includes formats for bibliographic data. That's the big one. That's the one we're going to talk about today. But also for authority data, the data that guides the preferred use of terms, names, and subject headings specifically. Holdings format, and this is used especially for serials, for journals and magazines, for libraries to record what their holdings of those particular titles are. There's a classification MARC format that can break parts of call numbers into specific pieces and record the various parts of a call number. If you ever created call numbers or used call numbers, you know that each part means something different. And having a MARC format, having an electronic format for storing that data can make searching call numbers a little easier. It's not, I don't believe it's really in wide use, but the format does exist. And then there's also the MARC community information format for a standard for storing community information that a library might be using. This might only be used at the Library of Congress, I'm not sure, but there is a MARC format for it. So our focus today is the MARC 21 format for bibliographic data. And I should mention too, the bibliographic data format, the MARC bibliographic format, was originally 7 different parts. There was one for books, there was one for music scores, one for recordings, one for maps, and there were some others too, which I don't remember offhand. In the early 1990s, when I started cataloging, the library decided, and actually the whole library community decided to go through what was called format integration to make those 7 formats into one format, one bibliographic format. So instead of having a specific MARC format for music scores, you just had all of the information that would have been included in that format included in a more general bibliographic format. So the MARC bibliographic format kind of got bigger and more complicated because it included all of these different types of material. If you've ever used OCLC, if you've cataloged in OCLC, you know that you still choose a specific bibliographic format for the item you're cataloging. So OCLC has actually retained some of that division of those formats, but the MARC format itself really is one. The bibliographic format is really just one format. MARC 21 is still used by most libraries worldwide for catalog data, and that's why it's important that we in libraries, all of us that work in libraries currently, need to understand it. Even though it's probably going to be replaced by this linked data concept being represented by BibFrame, any day now, we're still going to have a lot of MARC data to work with. In fact, most catalogs, as BibFrame becomes adopted, most catalogs will still have MARC data that will just be mapped to the BibFrame format. We probably won't replace all of our MARC records right away. We'll just display them in a way that can be used by MARC or by BibFrame. And I wanted to say too that if you don't have a lot of familiarity with MARC, the first time you see a MARC record, it can be a little scary. It's a whole bunch of numbers and codes, and it looks really complicated. And it is, but it's not really as scary as it looks, I maintain. It looks scary because it's really old. The format itself predates the idea of a relational database. I have a list of references at the end of the slides. There's an article from Code for Lib Journal that explains that really well. It gives a timeline of where MARC fits into the development of computers, basically, of our use of computers and of the internet. And the MARC format, Avram's format, came along before there was even any academic talk of a relational database. It's something that's very familiar to us now, to most people now, that you know what a database is. You have fields and you have information, you have data that varies in those fields depending on what you're trying to represent. But that was really a revolutionary concept when the MARC format was developed. MARC was developed using numbers for tagging instead of text. Most formats now that encode text use text for the encoding, XML being an example, where you have a tag that says this is the title. So it is clear when you look at the code itself what each thing is. MARC was developed when we still didn't have a lot of space in our computers. We needed to save space, and so using a 3-digit code to represent those tags was much more efficient. It looks complicated, and one of the problems with it now is that it doesn't interact well with other digital information. But at the time, it was the best way to do it. But it's not exactly intuitive when you look at a MARC record. You have to find out what those tags mean. The tags are not going to tell you by themselves. And then MARC also uses punctuation in what I would say is a weird way. And this is because of the International Standard for Bibliographic Description. This is another standard, yet another standard, a display standard that was developed after MARC, partly to work with MARC, but this guides the punctuation that we use in MARC records. And in fact, a lot of systems use that punctuation to separate the various parts of the MARC record. So when you have a colon in a certain place in the MARC record, that indicates to a computer that this information is what follows it. So it's not just the MARC coding, it's also this ISBD punctuation that signifies to some systems, to some catalog systems, what that data is. And there's a lot of good information about ISBD if you follow this link. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to go through some examples of MARC records. For just a couple of items, a nonfiction book and then a novel, to see the differences and how those are treated. These examples are both from the Library of Congress. The images are from Amazon, just full disclosure. Just copied them from Amazon. So we're going to start out with Neil deGrasse Tyson's Astrophysics for People in a Hurry, a nonfiction, popular but nonfiction book. Let's see. So this is the LC MARC record. This is from the Library of Congress catalog. So you can see that you have information here. You have the author and the title. That's about all you get from the cover. When you look at the MARC record, you have that information. You have the title and you have the author, but you have a whole lot more information. MARC is really considered a rich format. It includes a lot of data. Again, it's in a format that in the 21st century is not usable with other data, and so it's problematic, but it is still a very rich format. There's a lot of information in a relatively small space in a MARC record. We don't really need to save the space so much now in our modern computer systems, but when the MARC format was created, we really did. And so this was a very efficient way of saving a whole lot of data. And so you have, I'm going to talk more about what these specific fields are, but you have numbers that represent types of information. All right. A MARC record is often called a surrogate for an actual item. It stands in place, and this is what a catalog card did as well. You had that card that represented the item that was in your collection in a small form that could be filed with other information about the other items in your collection. A MARC record does the same thing. It represents the item that's being cataloged. It uses text and code to describe a physical item. It can also use text and code to describe a virtual item. MARC is definitely still used and is very actively used now to describe virtual items as well as physical items. This record, of course, is for a book, for this Neil deGrasse Tyson book, and its contents. So it describes both the physical thing. You have information about the number of pages and about the height of the book, but then you also have information about the content, what the book's about, and data that places the item into the context of the collection of which it is a part. I'm sorry about that typo. I noticed that a little bit earlier today. So the subject analysis part of this, you have the descriptive cataloging that tells what the book is, but then you also have information about what the book is about and where it fits in the rest of your collection. You have the call number, for instance, that gives you not only an idea of what the book's about, but also where it fits on your library shelf. And you might also have local notes that explain where it was purchased. These fields down there explain how the library got this item. In a catalog of books, each bibliographic entity, typically a book or a set of books, has its own MARC record. And if you're familiar with the Ferber model, if you think in terms of Ferber, the WEMI descriptions, the manifestation, each manifestation of a particular work usually will have its own bibliographic record. And like I said, please feel free to ask questions as I go through. If something just doesn't make sense, you want me to stop and go back, I definitely can try to do that. So here's another example. This is a novel, Little Fires Everywhere. Again, from the Library of Congress catalog. This is the MARC record, and you'll notice that this MARC record is much smaller. It's much shorter, and this is typical. A nonfiction book usually requires less data in the bibliographic record than a fiction book requires less data than a nonfiction book. A nonfiction book, you want to, oh dear, your page is blank. I wonder if that's true for everyone. Oh dear. Can anyone see the MARC record? Oh no! Oh, how strange. Well, I'll just tell you about it. Okay, some of you can see it and some of you can't. This is from the Library of Congress catalog, and if you go to the Library of Congress catalog and you search for the title Little Fires Everywhere, you'll get a page that has tabs. It has a tab for the display, and then it also has a tab for the MARC fields. And so these are just pictures of those MARC records. I'm sorry you can't see them. It probably has to do somehow with display of particular formats. In any case, the record is shorter for this fiction item because you're not including always subject headings. This particular record doesn't have a summary statement, so there's less information displayed. And this is going to be a little bit of a problem for those who can't see the slides. I'm very sorry about that. But there are various parts to a MARC record. And so I'm going to go through what those parts are. Oh, so good question. Why no subject headings? That's a Library of Congress decision. Basically, they typically do not assign subject headings to fiction. Most libraries do now assign subject headings to fiction, but the Library of Congress made the decision years ago not to try to assign subject headings for most fiction, for most novels. And yeah, definitely most books now you would put a summary statement, a 520 in the MARC record to say what the book is about. And the Library of Congress does usually provide that. It's usually, in fact, provided as part of the cataloging and publication information for novels. So yeah, for novels, the summary statement is usually more important than the subject headings. Okay. So the fields in a MARC record, that's the first part, kind of. Yes, you can have a summary statement for both fiction and nonfiction. So the fields, these are the fields, the OOO, and you'll hear catalogers talk about fields kind of in what I've seen described as MARC E's. There's a certain way we talk about MARC fields. And so the first field I would say is the OOO field, not the zero field, but the OOO field. Um, the 005 field has specific information, and each of these fields represents some different aspect of the description of the item. The 955 field, you'll hear catalogers and cataloging instructors specifically talk about the 9XX fields or the 3XX fields. What they mean is all of the fields that start with that particular number. The fields all start with a three-digit tag, and so when somebody talks about the 9XX fields, they're talking about all the fields that start with a 9. The 9XX fields are actually for local data, and so for the Library of Congress, if you can see this slide, has put a whole lot of data into the 955 field or the 955 field. Mostly having to do with what copies they have and how those copies are circulated. And then the 040 field, the 040 field is typically used to describe who did the cataloging of a record. This actually has information stating that this is English language cataloging done according to the RDA content standard. And then you have subfields. Each field has subfields. Some of the fields just have one subfield, some have many. The subfields are represented by these subfield codes. So here we have what a cataloger would call the delimiter A is a 7. The 7 is the content that goes into that subfield. So these are parts of the field. The subfield B or delimiter B. I'm going to explain what delimiter is in a minute. Again, this is local information for the Library of Congress. Delimiter E, as I said, the delimiter E in the 040 represents the content standard that was used to catalog the item. The delimiter 2 in the 082, I actually don't catalog in Dewey. I've never worked at a library that was cataloging in Dewey, and so I don't know a whole lot about the MARC structure for the Dewey call numbers, but the delimiter 2, that is part of that Dewey call number in the 082 field. And then you have field tags. These are the 3-digit codes at the beginning of each field. And as I said, each field represents a different type of information. So we have the 008 field. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. That's the fixed fields. Even though it's one field, it's often referred to as the fixed fields. I'll show you why in a minute. The 010 field, that is the Library of Congress card number, or Library of Congress control number is the name for it now, the LCCN. The 042 is a field specifically used to represent the fact that this record was created by the Program for Cooperative Cataloging. It's a Library of Congress catalog record, but it wasn't actually created by LC. It was created by this PCC. And then the 245 is the transcribed title, the title as you see it on the item you're cataloging. And then each field has indicators. Well, I should revise that. Some fields have indicators. There is space in each field for indicators, but not every field uses them, and not every field uses both. There are 2 spaces for indicators for every field in the MARC record. Some fields only use one, some fields use both. Some fields don't use the indicators at all. So this 925 field, again, a local use field used by the Library of Congress, has a first indicator 0. This 050 has a first indicator 0 and a second indicator 0. That actually I do know. The 050 is for Library of Congress call numbers, and the 2 zeros represent the fact that this is a Library of Congress call number created by the Library of Congress for an item that is actually held in the collection. And so all of that information is displayed just with these 2 little numbers. And that's why MARC really is, it's a compact and a rich field that did great work for what it needed to do for the years it's been used. But it is time to replace it, but it still has some amazing features. The 100 field here for the preferred form or the authorized form of the author's name has a first indicator 1, and the first indicator 1 in the 100 represents the fact that the name is given with the surname first. And then you have subfield codes that separate the subfields within each field. I've tried to highlight these, and I hope you'll be able to see the highlighting. I actually cannot see the highlighting myself, so that's a problem. There were little bits of highlighting. I'll try to circle them, but I don't think you can see. Let's see if I can get a pointer. I don't think I can.
If you click on draw.
Click on draw. Is that this? Let's see what happens. Oh, can you see that? So there's a subfield code. Some people are typing to say whether or not I can. Okay, nope.
Where are you highlighting?
What does it look like? In the 001, trying to draw a box.
Oops.
Oh, I need to click on draw at the top. Let's see. Well, I'll just describe it. Yeah. So, oh, you did. Okay, so some people did. So these are I'll just describe them. These little codes in the if you can see the image, the little pipe characters, the straight up and down lines that are followed by single lowercase letters, those are the subfield codes. The letters themselves are the codes, and the little straight up and down line, the pipe characters, those are what are called delimiters. And so you'll hear catalogers talk about, when they're talking about the subfield, they'll sometimes say the subfield A or the subfield B, but they'll also sometimes say the delimiter A or the delimiter B, and they're usually referring to that whole subfield, not just to the delimiter, which is the pipe character, or the subfield code. They're usually referring to that whole subfield. So this is the delimiter D, for instance, or the subfield D. So I'll move on from those. Yep, none of my highlighting is showing up. Yeah, and then I had the delimiters marked too, and I just had these little pieces here, the little pipe characters highlighted. After you click draw, you click on one of the buttons on the left. Oh, there's a marker. Oh, there we go. There we go. So there's the subfield. I'm not very good with this freehand. So here's a subfield, and this is a subfield code, also known as a subfield delimiter. Or the delimiter is actually the pipe character, and then you have, okay, kind of messy drawing. Sorry about that. And then you have the subfield code. So I'll move on from these. But the delimiters are the little characters, in this case, the pipe character that precedes the code itself. And let's get to my slide that shows various. So the subfield delimiters are represented in different catalog systems by different characters. You just saw them using the pipe character is used in the Library of Congress system, at least in the publicly accessible version. They represent those delimiters with a pipe character. You'll sometimes see a $ used to represent the delimiters, the double dagger, or a graphic that looks like that double dagger. I think I've also seen a does not equal sign used as the delimiter, or an @ sign in some systems. And it's the character designated by that system to say this is the beginning of a subfield, and then the code, the single lowercase letter, says which subfield that is. And actually, subfields can also be numerically coded. The subfield codes can be numeric as well, but single digits or single characters. Oh, and somebody asked about printing the presentation out. I believe so. I think that, Aaron, will those be sent out? And I can send it to people too if you want to request it. Okay, yeah, you'll get a copy, a PDF of the slides. So hopefully too the PDF will have the highlighting. Okay, so going more into the parts of the record, and again, you won't be able to see all of my highlighting. You might be able to see some of this. The leader field is a part of the MARC record, and sometimes when you see a MARC record in its kind of pure form, all of these things will be run together, and there will be characters that separate the fields, just as there are those delimiters that separate the subfields. But the first few characters of the MARC record are what is called the leader. They have information, kind of general information about the record itself. And that is in the 000 field. When the MARC record is displayed in this format, it's in the 000 field, but it's actually just the first few characters of the record itself. So the 000 is the leader. The control fields are the 001, the 005, and the 008. These have to do with how the system is going to interpret the information in the rest of the record. They give direction to the system. And then the 008 field it's a control field, but it's also called the fixed fields. Even though it's a single field, it's sometimes referred to as the fixed fields. And that is because in most systems, the 008 is broken out so that the cataloger can enter the data with some prompts so that you don't have to remember where this is a certain number of characters. And so the third character has a specific meaning. The third character in the field has a specific meaning, but catalogers aren't expected to count out every field in most systems. They actually have some prompts that tell them, okay, this is where you put the date, this is where you put the type of date, this is where you put the code for where the item was published. That's all information that's represented in the 008, but in the MARC record itself, it's just this coded data. This is a OCLC version of that record for Little Fires Everywhere, that same MARC record. And you see up at the top, these are the fixed fields. So this is the data that comes from the 008. And if you're cataloging in the OCLC system, OCLC gives you these prompts. So you don't have to remember where this code A goes, and you don't have to remember what it is. You just have to know what code to put there. You don't have to know where in the 008 it actually goes. The system will do that for you. And I should have mentioned too, the control fields are actually generated by the record itself. The cataloger does not create those control fields, the system does. So you input the record, and then the system generates the control fields to guide the system in interpreting what you've put in your MARC record. Okay, so when you're creating MARC records, you need a lot of tools, and that's probably evident from all of the things we've been talking about. You need local practice guides. So every library has their own decisions made about how they're going to input MARC data and how they're going to use it. Library of Congress has specific things that they've decided to do, both having to do with the content standard and having to do with the MARC format itself. And every library has those. OCLC has their own local decisions, and so you need to know what those local decisions are. And so you'll need whatever guides have been produced by your institution, the institution for which you're cataloging, to know what those choices are. You need system guides. You need to know how the system you're using treats this MARC data and uses this MARC data. I just showed you a picture of a OCLC cataloging interface display. Every system that you might be using to catalog is going to display the MARC data slightly differently, and so you need to know how you input that MARC data and how the MARC data you might upload into that system is going to be displayed both to the cataloger and to the user in your particular system. You need the MARC documentation that is available for free on the Library of Congress website. I have a link at the end of the presentation about that. It's extensive. In fact, the MARC documentation, the official MARC documentation, is very, very detailed. If you want really specific information about what a particular MARC field is, go to the Library of Congress website and you'll be able to find it. But it can be a little too detailed. You sometimes need to go to those system guides or those local practice guides to really figure out which of those parts you need to actually understand and how they're used in your particular system. If you're cataloging in MARC, you also need content standards, things like RDA. And if your library still uses AACR2, you need AACR2 instead of RDA. And those ISBD standards. ISBD, I have to admit, I've just kind of learned on the job as a cataloger for all these years. I know where the punctuation needs to be to meet the ISBD standard, but I don't go back and refer to ISBD all the time. I do refer to RDA. If I'm doing original cataloging and I need to make sure I'm creating a record according to the RDA standard, I do go to the RDA toolkit to make sure that what I'm doing fits that standard. You might want to use example records, both from your library and from other libraries, especially the Library of Congress. I use the Library of Congress website all the time if I'm cataloging something and I'm not sure how to represent it specifically in the MARC format, or even just in terms of subject headings or call numbers. I might try to find a record that is similar on a similar topic or in a similar format to see how the Library of Congress has treated it. The Library of Congress for most libraries is the standard bearer, and so it's a good free resource to use those examples. This is the page that has the MARC 21 format for bibliographic data. Like I said, it's free. MARC 21 was actually, it's the version of MARC that was meant to work in the 21st century. It was, as you can see here, released in 1999 and has continued to be updated. And will probably, eventually, this will probably be the last MARC format, and we'll start working with BibFrame, with this linked data version of bibliographic data before we would, instead of having a new MARC format. But this has all of the information that you really need about a MARC record. And like I said, it's extremely detailed, every little bit. And two, you have to remember, MARC record was created for Library of Congress use, and so some of the MARC fields really don't apply to any library other than the Library of Congress, but it's very helpful to know why they're there. This is OCLC's Bibliographic Formats and Standards page. This has been in kind of a constant state of flux since the release of RDA. They're continuing to try to revise it as RDA changes. But it is a very useful tool, especially if you are an OCL at a library that's an OCLC member. This is the local practice guide for the OCLC database, for the WorldCat database. This tells you how the MARC fields are used in WorldCat. Very, very handy, and it's a little bit more user-friendly than the MARC format guide on the Library of Congress site. And if you're cataloging in OCLC, in OCLC Connection, you can actually right-click on any field and get to this guide. And I believe that the path is even quicker if you're cataloging in Connection online in OCLC. Very, very helpful information. This is just further down on that same page in Bibliographic Formats and Standards. So I want to talk just a little bit about the display of MARC record. MARC records. Modern library catalogs are databases, and the MARC data is typically broken apart for storage. You enter your MARC data, you upload a record in the MARC format, but the system doesn't always store it just in the MARC format. It typically will break those pieces of data apart and store them in a way that makes sense for that particular system. And then the pieces are brought back together from those sections for the display. That display may or may not be customizable. It depends on your system. Of course, there are a lot of open source library systems available now, and some of those can be pretty customizable if you're willing to play with the code a bit. Some of the commercial library systems may be customizable. You might have to pay the company that sold you the software some money to change the display. But the display can be flexible based on this MARC data. There's a lot that can be done with it, but not as much as a modern system really needs, and that's why we're eventually moving away from MARC, a big part of it. So here we have again that example of astrophysics for people in a hurry. The MARC record for that particular item with all that data, with all the numbers representing all the data. And this is how it's displayed in the Library of Congress catalog. You have that data from the 245 displayed in bold so that people know right away this is the title that they just found a record for. And then you have these user-friendly tags. So the data from the 100 field, say, in the MARC record is pulled into the display with the personal name tag instead of the 100. So instead of the user having to know what the 100 means, it's explained. This is the personal name of the author, etc. And then that same record displayed in the WorldCat, the public face or the OPAC of the WorldCat database. So this is worldcat.org. You get that nice picture of the cover. Linked access points, so the fields that are under authority control that are preferred forms of names actually can link out to find other instances of that name in the catalog. But this is all pulled from that MARC data and just displayed in the way that OCLC thinks is most useful for their user base. And then here we have our novel example and the slightly shorter MARC record. And here it is displayed in the Library of Congress catalog and in OCLC. Here's my list of references. I highly recommend all of these. I found it all very interesting reading. There's a lot more information on MARC on the web if you want to take a look. And now we have 10 minutes for questions. If anybody has any, if you want me to go back through any of the slides, I'm more than happy to do so. If there was something about one of those specific MARC records you'd like me to delve into a little bit more in depth, just anything at all. Questions about how I learned MARC and how I use it currently. Whatever you want to ask, we have plenty of time. So I'll give people a second. Let's see if I got all the questions. I should double check that. Let's see if I can. Yeah, I think I got them. Let me know if I didn't. Okay. What's the difference between the abstract and summary? Well, that's a good question. The summary field in the MARC record, and I'll go back to one of them here. Go back to an example because the Neil deGrasse Tyson book did have a summary. So the 520 or the 520 field is the summary statement. And yes, you could refer to this as an abstract, and indeed, I believe that if you were cataloging a dissertation, you might use the 520 to put the abstract. And so it really, I would say that an abstract is really just kind of a more academic term for a summary. An abstract is a summary, typically of an academic paper of some sort. Personal preference for cataloging OCLC. That's a really good question. I think my personal preference is guided by my experience. I learned to catalog in Connection, in OCLC Connection. And so in some ways, I'm more comfortable doing my cataloging there. But there's some advantages. The library actually the library I've worked with throughout my professional career, both libraries have used Innovative's ILSs. And so I'm really familiar with those too. There are some things, it kind of depends on what I'm working on. If I'm making big changes to the MARC itself, to the coding itself, I tend to do that in OCLC because OCLC is a little, the connection product is a little bit easier to work with. Again, that though might just be experience. That's what I've used the most. So I think it depends. It depends. And the innovative ILS, there's a lot of customization possible. If I'm doing a big global change, the OC or the innovative system gives you a lot of options for doing that kind of thing. So it really depends. Summary statement from the publisher. Yeah, that's kind of an RDA guides you some on that. If you use a summary statement from the publisher, typically you would put it in quotes in the 520. If the Library of Congress has provided CIP data for the title, the 520 gets represented just without quotes. You don't even have to say where you got it. If you're making up your own summary, same thing. You just put the 520 information in without quotes. So I just to save time, I will use the summary statement from wherever I can get it. If it's in the CIP data, I'll just copy and paste it there. If it's, of course, the Library of Congress has usually done the cataloging. That's usually you're not in a library like mine, at least you're not cataloging an item that has CIP data because cataloging's already been done. But yes, I will copy and paste information from a publisher's website, for instance, for summary data on a regular basis. So is there anything else, anything we didn't cover that you were hoping that we would cover today? Just for today and for future reference, if there's anything that you were hoping we'd delve into that we didn't, we might have time to do a little of it, or maybe we can do it next time if not. I see multiple attendees typing. That's good. Okay. Brief explanation of RDA. Okay, RDA, Resource Description and Access, is the replacement for AACR2, the Anglo-American Cataloging Rules. It's considered a worldwide content standard. It tells you how, in a standardized way, libraries are inputting data. So it tells you where you get this information for the title, how you quote the information about the edition, what information you need to include in a bibliographic record. So that's the brief explanation of RDA. It was created, developed by the same group of people, mostly American and British catalogers who had created AACR2. It was adopted by the Library of Congress in 2013, and so by a lot of libraries, at least in the United States at that time. Indicators, that's a good question. Indicators represent different things for different fields. So the 00 in the 082, the 0 in the first indicator there indicates something completely different than a first indicator 0 in the 505. It depends on the field. For each field, the indicators are used for different things. And so that's the kind of thing that a guide like the OCLC Bibliographic Formats and Standards is so helpful for. You can just go to that guide and see what indicator you should be using for that field, and I do it all the time. Some of them I have memorized after 20 years of cataloging, but a lot of them I don't, so I look them up all the time. Oh, good question about the series. There's some history with that. The 440 tag used to be used to represent a series statement that appeared on the item you were cataloging in exactly the same form as the authorized form of that series. So the authority record form of the series exactly matched what was on the item. then you would just put the series statement into the 440 and be done with it. That was changed a few years back, I think 2006, 2008. The 440 is no longer used. You now use the 490 field to transcribe the series title as you see it on the item, and then the 800 or the 830 field to transcribe the series title as it appears on the authority record. So the 800 or 830 field is the form that's indexed, the form of the series that's indexed, and the 490 is the way that it's transcribed from the item. Interactive MARC basic classes. Aaron will correct me as I'm wrong, but I believe that the course in person on Friday is going to be an interactive course. I think you had to have already signed up for that this time. But yeah, there are interactive MARC basics classes. I would do some web searches, and it might be something that if you're not able to do one on Friday, it might be something that will be repeated by the network. 2 places to add information such as author. Yeah, okay, that's a good question. So, and this is dictated by the MARC format to some extent. It's also guided some by the content standard, by RDA in this case. The 100 field in the MARC record is for what's called the main entry. If you have a title or an author main entry, if there's a single author for a book or a main author, the authorized version of that person's name goes in the 100 field, and then any additional authors or contributors go in the 700 fields. So that's a brief explanation of that. Yes, you will be getting the slides, and okay, Friday's workshop is done every year. I would highly recommend it. Dr. Snow is a very good teacher. She's a lot of fun, much more funny than me. She is a very good teacher. So if you can do that, I would recommend it. Let's see, did I get most of those questions? I hope so. Well, thank you all very much again. And feel free, let me see, I'm going to get back to my contact information here. Feel free to contact me at any time. If you think of other questions, want me to talk a little bit more about something I tried to explain, please don't hesitate to contact me. Thank you all very much and have a good day.
And thank you, Maureen, for a very informative webinar. Attendees, if you enjoyed this webinar, we encourage you to join us for Maureen's next webinar, which is RDA in the Real World, which will take place on Thursday, February 28th. She also has other webinars coming up in our fiscal year, so keep an eye out for those. As always, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland CE calendar on the website, Swiftland's Facebook page, or look for your message from the various library listservs. Thank you everyone for attending and have a terrific rest of your day.